Welcome back. I'm here to talk about reducing college costs. We're going to talk about this as a takeoff from the article that you read called 25 Ways to Reduce Cost of College that came out of the Center for College Affordability and Productivity. There are a lot of authors of that paper, two of whom are ones you should know about, Richard Vedder and Andrew Gillen. You have another article to read this course by Gillen. And Richard Vedder is a prominent critic of college cost structures. He's an economist, and he places himself on the political right. He's an outspoken critic of the way colleges work, and you'll get that understanding as you read that article and listen to the approach that he's got to cutting college costs. I'm not critiquing his politics. I'm critiquing the approach that he takes to cutting college costs. This article really focuses on how we can make college cheaper for students. But in fact, I want to think about how we do that. There are ways to make college cheaper for students, and there are ways to reduce the cost of delivering education. Regardless of the way we go through to make college cheaper for students, it will likely involve budget cuts. And I want to make a distinction between budget cuts and cost cuts. Those things are conceptually different. Budget cutting is cutting out dollars from your expense budget, your operational budget. That doesn't necessarily reduce the cost of delivering education. A really classic example of that would be a short-term budget cut that is a hiring freeze. So, for example, Bethel University is going into a budget cutting experience this year. And one of the things that we're doing is taking a very close look at every opening that we have on faculty or staff. And we're asking, do we need to hire immediately or could we delay? If we can delay the hire, that will have a budget cut effect for next year. That is, we won't have to spend that money. We'll reduce that operational line. But it's very likely that if we just do this hiring freeze where we use current openings to reduce our operational cost, that's not strategic, it's not a long-term cut, it's not an effective cut, it is an opportunistic approach to cutting budgets. And those short-term budget decisions are not likely to have long-term effects on the nature of college costs. So cutting budgets is not the same thing as reducing costs. Cost savings requires strategic and courageous choices. It involves doing things differently, and doing things differently takes creativity. It takes a new way of looking at what we are doing today to see something that most other people don't see. So it's got to be innovative. Usually cost cutting is something that will face serious opposition. Every time I've been involved in a budget cutting effort, which is way too often in higher education, we have experienced significant opposition from members in the community. Things like cutting an academic program are particularly difficult. Every place that I've been has struggled to cut academic programs. There are a number of reasons for that. One is that faculty members aren't like machines. You can't reprogram a faculty member to teach in a different area. Usually you've got to let the faculty member go if you cut a program. It's also the case that faculty members teach in programs that they are really committed to. They love their discipline. That's why they've gone on and earned advanced degrees in their discipline. So when you cut a program, it's a lot like cutting off a part of them, something that they love, something that they really are committed to. So if you are going to reduce the cost of education, and that cost reduction involves cutting programs or cutting operational areas, you're going to have significant pushback from people, and it's going to be a battle. The point here is that sometimes when you are asked to find savings, people choose the easy way. They do budget cuts that are opportunistic, not strategic. To make strategic cuts that involve actual cost savings, that usually requires doing things quite differently than you've done them in the past, and that kind of change will create opposition from the community that's tough to navigate. I think that that's why, frankly, colleges and universities are not very good at finding savings, because there will be significant opposition to cuts. And in an academic community, faculty have a lot of power, and they will stand in front of program cuts. They make it very difficult at times to make cuts. I'll give you a specific example from my past. I was leaning into the need to cut budgets, and we had a review of academic programs. We had a French major that had 2 students in it. This is 2 students in 4 years of undergraduate education. We had less than a full-time faculty member teaching in the French program, and I made the decision to cut that program. It went before the faculty senate, and it was an extremely difficult faculty meeting. Even though there was no full-time faculty member, even though there were only 2 majors, it was viewed as an erosion of the liberal arts. It was viewed as a lack of commitment to globalization. It was viewed as treading on territory that faculty viewed as extremely important land. They did not want to cede any part of liberal arts education or any part of a global perspective or a cross-cultural perspective. So even though it was losing a lot of money, even though there were almost no students there, it was not a favorable faculty view of cutting that program. In the end, the administration made the choice to cut the program in spite of the faculty opposition. My point in that story is to show that even when there aren't a lot of immediate stakeholders affected by a decision, among faculty, when choices are made to cut academic programs that are viewed as seminal, there will be opposition. When you are making the choice to cut costs, you start with assumptions about where you need to cut. And those assumptions will be driven by worldview, they'll be driven by theoretical perspective, they'll be driven by current necessities. But I think it's important to step back and examine assumptions before the budget cutting or cost cutting efforts start. One approach to think about is to look at theoretical perspectives, and one theoretical perspective you know about is Bowen's revenue theory. Another is Archibald and Feldman's cost disease approach. If you think Bowen is right, that people are always striving after excellence and they're throwing money at excellence, and that desire to become excellent results in a lot of student life extras or academic extras, then the cost-cutting exercise is going to be one of stripping down education to its essentials. You're going to get rid of anything that seems superfluous to the main academic enterprise. If you're Archibald and Feldman in your orientation, and you think cost disease is at fault for driving up costs in higher education, then you've got to carefully examine the employment model. And in particular, you've got to examine the model where a large number of faculty deliver education to a relatively few number of students. You're going to focus your efforts in cost cutting on the faculty model, and you're going to have to figure out how you can use fewer faculty to deliver education to a greater number of students. My point here is that your theoretical structure is going to drive your decision making when you do cost cutting. Second thing that's really important to think about is how quickly can you make those changes? How fast do you think you can implement cost-cutting decisions? As I alluded to earlier, academia is not a place where change is easy, and you will face opposition when making changes, but you also face an annual cycle. It is difficult to make changes in November. Instead, most of the changes are going to happen over the summer so they can be implemented in the fall. If you're trying to implement change, it's difficult to do it outside of the semester or quarter structure that most universities operate by. So you've got to attend to the calendar, you've got to attend to the academic rhythm, you've also got to take people with you when you try to implement change. And people don't love change, especially change that's threatening, change that is the loss of programs or structures or systems that they were used to. And so cutting costs requires political savviness, social savviness, an understanding of the academic environment, and an understanding of the academic rhythm. When you're making cost-cutting decisions, when you're thinking about academic programs in particular, it's essential that you ask about the impact on academic programs. Particularly, it's important to ask, if I make this cut, will this negatively impact the student experience? Will it lower the quality of instruction? Will it reduce the quality of educational outcomes? Those three questions are all about academic quality. And of course, that's at the heart of our enterprise, and those are always the first three questions to ask. A related question, less about academic quality, but it's an important question when making cutting decisions, is, are you actually able to cut out the cost, or are you really just shifting the cost to another part of the university? It's easy to make cuts in one part of the university and shift the responsibility for that work to something that's not under your influence. But when we're trying to make higher education less expensive for students, we've got to actually ensure that we're cutting costs entirely, not shifting them from one part of the university to another. It's also important to make sure that we are not harming the ability of a university to contribute to the common good through research productivity. Higher education in the United States is responsible for a lot of innovation across the country. Not all of it. Certainly corporations do a lot. But higher education is contributing to the common good by contributing ideas, artistic works, scholarly efforts that have shaped our culture in very positive ways. And when we do cost cutting in order to reduce costs for students, it's easy to lose sight of this part of the academic enterprise that contributes to the common good in meaningful ways that have shaped the United States and certainly shaped all of Western culture, probably all of culture across the world. A most difficult question, I would say, as you're thinking about cost cutting, is what are some unintended consequences that might result from this? Knowing what unintended consequences might result takes a lot of creative thinking, a lot of lateral thinking. It requires decision makers to step back from their immediate decisions and evaluate the secondary and tertiary impacts of their decisions. If I cut this dollar out, what is the downstream impact of that on not necessarily students, but the people surrounding the students? Or if I make this change to faculty, it might not affect all faculty, but it could affect staff that surround faculty. So try to think of secondary and tertiary impact as you think about unintended consequences. Again, that's not a simple thing to do. It does require creativity and it requires a lot of thought. But if we don't pay attention to unintended consequences of budget cuts, we are not doing our due diligence when we make budget cuts. Making decisions to cut costs in higher education is a complicated enterprise. It requires creative thinking, it requires critical thinking, and there are probably a host of questions that you could add on top of those 6 that I've listed there. And I encourage you, especially if you are part of any budget cutting exercise in the near future, to ask those questions and other questions as well. To get back to the article that you read, the 25 Ways to Cut Costs article, Vedder and Company, talk about 25 ways to cut costs, and they're really talking about a couple of different things, and I want to unpack those a little bit by looking at categories. First of all, they ask about how they can make cost less expensive for students. Those are, first of all, about changing enrollment patterns. They talk about enrolling in dual enrollment courses in high school, which, by the way, Minnesota is really good at promoting. They talk about efforts to ask students to attend community colleges for a couple of years before they transfer to a 4-year college, and that is a definite savings to students. It's not about changing the cost of college. It's about changing the cost of college to students. So universities will still be just as expensive to operate, but students will pay less. They appropriately talk about ways to ease transfer of credit across universities. And in recent years, there's been really a significant effort in the state of Minnesota and across the country to ensure that transfer of credit is easy for students to do. Transfer of credit policies at many colleges and universities historically has been very problematic. A recent story is a person I know transferred from a CCCU school, a Christian college that's small and not very well known, to the University of Texas at Austin. And when that person transferred, he lost essentially all of his general education credit. It did not count for general education at UT Austin, and he had to redo approximately 50 credits. So he had elective credit that transferred in, but it didn't meet any of the requirements that he needed for his academic program. And as a result, he lost a year and a half in college costs. So efforts to make transfer of credit much easier for students is appropriate. It's not a cost savings for universities, doesn't reduce the cost of delivering education necessarily, but it definitely makes it easier for students to pay for college and to transfer between schools. Recent effort is to create 3-year bachelor's degrees. A friend of mine is president at Grace College and Seminary in Winona Lake, Indiana. And when he became president there, he initiated an effort to create 3-year academic programs for all of his undergraduate degrees. And he showed me recent data that indicated that as a result of those 3-year programs, he's increased his enrollment almost 25%. And it's a very attractive thing for students. What they've also found is that relatively few students will complete their degree in 3 years anyway, because it's tough to complete a degree in 3 years. In Europe, however, 3-year bachelor's degrees are the norm, and it does make sense that colleges and universities would reduce costs for students by completing their degree in 3 years. The problem with that, of course, if you're trying to operate a university, is that you're collecting revenue from students for 3 years, not 4. So you're reducing your revenue source. It's highly likely that you're not reducing the number of courses that you offer. And as a result, you're making it cheaper for students to go to college, but you're not making it cheaper to deliver education. And that creates a tension for the university. It's also important that policies are created within universities that encourage timely completion. And in fact, the federal government is very interested in students completing college in 4 years. As a result, the House in December of 2017 proposed changes to the Higher Education Authorization Act that provides an incentive to Pell recipients to finish in 4 years. So this is something that Vedder has promoted in public, and especially the Republican-controlled House has paid attention to Vedder's proposal, and they are actually incentivizing through the release of Pell funds for 4-year completion. It's a good thing. It doesn't, again, reduce college costs to deliver education, but it will help students pay less for education. We also want to find other ways to reduce costs for students. We can reduce textbook costs. Bethel is currently looking at open educational resources for undergraduate programs. Open ed resources are free to students, and you can get a textbook for free, therefore, versus some undergraduate textbooks are $150, $200, $250, or even more than that, especially in the natural sciences. That's very much of a win-win. Won't cost the colleges anything to provide those free resources, or it costs very little, and it saves students quite a bit of money. The other recommendation that is in this category of reducing expenses for students is to increase aid and to provide aid directly to students, not to institutions. On this slide, what I'm focused on is there are a lot of ideas in the 25 Ways paper that focus on reducing tuition costs or other related costs for students. And those are good things, but they're certainly not about changing the way that higher education operates. I want to move on and talk now about making the cost of education less. And here we're talking about, from the 25 Ways article, actual ways to reduce the cost of delivering education. They come in various categories, and one of the things that they talk about in the 25 Ways paper is to change employment structures in colleges and universities. They spend a lot of pages talking about how to end tenure. They argue in that paper that tenure is expensive for colleges and universities, and if we can end the tenure process, the tenure system in North American higher education, we will necessarily reduce the overall cost of delivering education. In my opinion, that argument is relatively weak. The primary point of savings, if we end tenure, could be that removal of faculty would be less problematic. If you've got a faculty member who is not delivering education well, no longer a contributing member of an educational community, without tenure it may be less litigious, involve fewer lawyers to get rid of a faculty member. And that would be a significant cost savings, but ending tenure is not an immediate cost reduction for colleges or universities. I leave it to you to go back through that paper and critique that section on tenure. There are some very good points made, and there are some weak points made, and engage your critical thinking on that. Another potential way to reduce the cost of college is to increase teaching loads per faculty member. It is common in a large state university or Research One university that teaching loads could be 3 courses a year or 4 courses a year, versus at a relatively small private liberal arts college where teaching loads could be 8 courses a year. The cost of a faculty member will stay roughly the same, but if a faculty member is only teaching a couple of courses a semester, you've got to hire somebody else to teach other courses that full-time faculty member is not teaching. If you can get full-time faculty members to increase the number of courses per year that they are teaching, you don't have to hire as many part-time faculty to teach. So increasing teaching loads is in fact a quick way to reduce the cost of delivering education. It's also potentially a way to get full-time faculty more engaged with students. By having them in the classroom more, they are definitely going to be connecting more with students, and hopefully they will be more committed to support of students. And that is an idea that will be carefully looked at in the coming years as more and more colleges and universities seek to drive down their costs, and in particular, to drive down the costs of instruction for courses. If you've already got full-time faculty members, then get them focused on teaching somewhat less than they are currently focused on research, and that may be a way to save money. That, of course, will reduce research loads, and research loads are quite expensive. If a faculty member is doing research when they could be teaching a course, the direct cost of that will be at least $10,000 for a full-time faculty member a year. So every course not taught is somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 cost for the university. And if that flows into research and that research is very productive, it's probably worth it. And if that research is not productive, not really contributing to a discipline, it's probably not worth the cost for the university. Another approach that's worth looking at is to reduce the administrative overhead. The desire to lower the head count of deans, of other staff people, of senior academic leadership, and of senior leadership is really attractive. If you get rid of a cabinet member, for example, someone at the vice president or senior vice president level, you're probably conservatively talking about eliminating $175,000 from a budget. Versus if you eliminate a full-time faculty member, you're probably talking about conservatively eliminating $125,000 from a budget. And if you're eliminating other staff, especially low-level staff, you're probably talking about eliminating $50,000 to $75,000 from the budget per position. So it's very attractive to try to eliminate a vice president or a senior vice president, because every head you reduce, you are saving a pretty big dollar amount. If you reduce administrative assistants, custodians, it's not a big savings to try to eliminate those people. So examining the structure of especially senior leadership and leadership is a worthwhile effort whenever budgets are in need of reduction. If you can eliminate for the long term any senior level position, you are saving. Now, the question, of course, that you have to ask there is what's the downstream impact of that? If you eliminate a vice president, will there be less oversight over key areas? Will there be less innovation happening? Will there be the possibility that mistakes are made that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in a given year? So those kinds of questions are important. Downstream impact of decisions matters. But if you can reduce administrative headcount, it's a wise thing to do. Second category in the 25 Ways article is to talk about streamlining programming. And one way to do that is to cut underperforming programs. I talked earlier about eliminating the French program from the school I was at previous to this one and how painful that was. But it's really important to evaluate the cost structures of programs, the enrollment patterns of programs, and to either cut or reduce faculty in underperforming programs. It is part of program prioritization, and you'll be reading about that in the fourth module. It is an important part of the academic work as we are in the second decade of the 21st century. My guess is as we head into the 2020s, you'll see a lot of cuts to underperforming programs in American colleges and universities. Another way to do that is to carefully examine whether we're spending too much on athletics. As I deliver this PowerPoint lecture right now, the NCAA is under fire for misbehavior in basketball programs across the country. There seems to be a departure from an academic mission when people focus on athletics. Most athletic programs do not make money for a university. That is, the direct cost of athletic programs is cost that doesn't contribute to the academic enterprise. On the other hand, these are never simple questions. We attract students to a university because we have athletic programs. The football program at Bethel attracts more than 100 students. If you do away with those programs, your recruiting costs are going to go up. Your head count of students could well decline, and the decline of student heads may outpace the savings that you would reap by eliminating certain athletic programs. So these are not simple choices. Administrators face really serious dilemmas when trying to decide whether to invest in athletics or eliminate athletics. And the answers are never completely clear, and they're always a kind of place your bet and see what happens decision. It's also important that redundancies across systems get eliminated. Universities are complicated enterprises. You've got multiple colleges within a university typically, or multiple schools. Each of those schools may be replicating certain kinds of systems. And as you go into a cost-cutting exercise, it's important to take a broad look at a university and see, are we redundantly creating IT structures across parts of the university? Are we redundantly creating billing structures? Are we redundantly buying software packages that we could centralize? And those kinds of redundancies must be eliminated. It's smart. It's just really hard work to do because few people have in their job description a look across the university to examine all the areas that might be cut. It's also the case that in higher education, classrooms sit idle for long periods of time. If we could figure out ways to schedule classes very systematically so that we can bring in outside groups who could use those spaces, so that we don't overbuild and have too many classrooms, it is valuable to do a facility use study, and those studies usually take a couple of months. They come back with recommendations for what classroom space should look like, how we might restructure academic scheduling in order to better use those facilities. And what that will do is not necessarily save money immediately or bring in revenue immediately, but it could definitely help a college or university avoid building a new building that's not needed. Right now, it's important that we take a close look at partnerships outside of a single university. In the Twin Cities, there are a lot of private colleges and universities. If there was a consortium that could do collaborative purchasing, it would save money across each of those schools. We do that with libraries. We do that with other kinds of purchasing It's an obvious way to find savings, but it's a difficult political effort. It's also possible that we can outsource services. At Bethel, we outsource food service, we outsource printing services and our mailroom services. Those are, in some cases, money-saving efforts, and in other cases, they are quality improvement efforts. It's wonderful if we can both save money and improve quality. Every time you outsource something, you are running the risk of losing control over a central enterprise that is necessary to do good work, and it's a risk for a university, but it's worth looking at. Other things that are often outsourced include IT and facilities support. Finally, we can try to leverage technology. The 25 Ways paper talks about moving classes online. And the reality is that moving classes online saves little or no money. Average class sizes don't go up. The infrastructure required to create good online classes is significant. I'm sitting in an expensive voiceover booth right now. There's an expensive microphone. There's a guy in another room who's doing great work to ensure the quality of the online course. And it is important that people understand that moving classes online is not an immediate cost savings or even any cost savings. It might reduce brick and mortar costs years down the line, but online education is not less expensive, and that idea is one that should be expunged from most administrators' mind. Online instruction is not cheaper instruction. Second idea is to digitize libraries. Again, it's hard to see how that would really be a cost savings. We can use cloud-based services, and those might reduce costs for us. The whole idea of leveraging technology is problematic, and you know that Archibald and Feldman highlight that in their book, and that's worth making sure you understand well. It's also important that we innovate. Accreditation is in many cases a barrier to innovation. Accreditation is essential to higher education in the United States. If you do not have regional accreditation or national accreditation of some sort, you can't tap into federal funding. Accreditation exists to ensure quality. It does not exist to ensure innovation. And often what we find is that regional accrediting bodies create criteria for accreditation that slow down innovation in academia. A good example, if Bethel wants to start a new degree program, the accrediting body, the Higher Learning Commission, requires that we go through all of our internal due diligence. It requires that we go through any statewide due diligence, and then it requires that we go through any specialized accrediting effort. And then the Higher Learning Commission, after we've gone through all of those things, is willing to look at our proposal to start a new program. Being quick to market is extremely difficult in an environment that is regulated by accrediting bodies. And that regulation by accrediting bodies is essential because it taps into the ability to get federal loans for our students and the ability to get grants for our students. We have, therefore, in North America, a higher education system that is simultaneously being told we have to innovate, we have to change, we have to adapt to a changing environment. But by the way, in order to get access to federal funding, you have to go through accreditation, and accreditation requires lots of hoops to jump through, and that slows the process down enormously. If we could find a way to balance accreditation's desire to ensure quality and also to promote innovation, I think we would be further ahead. My guess is that kind of change in accreditation systems in the United States right now is at least 10 years away. Accreditation has gotten much more complicated in the last 10 years. It has not gotten easier. And what we've also seen is that it pretty much doesn't matter whether a Republican is in the White House or a Democrat is in the White House. The Department of Education is a regulatory body that imposes regulations. It does not waive regulations. What's really interesting to me, and I admit I'm on a soapbox right now, but what's really interesting to me is that the federal government in the House and the Senate talks about the need for higher education to innovate on the one hand, and on the other hand, they put more regulations in place so that it's harder to innovate. It makes for a challenging environment to become really creative. And as a result, it's difficult to innovate, and most of the changes that we engage in higher education are tweaks, not actual innovations. That doesn't mean that it's impossible to innovate in radical ways, but it's difficult. What I'd like to do for the remainder of this talk is to look at what radical cost-saving innovation would look like.